when Hurricane Harvey ripped through the Texas coast, leaving destruction in its wake. Sarah found herself stranded in a town she barely knew, surrounded by strangers picking up the pieces. And then came Rusty, a wild bobcat, known by the locals but belonging to no one. When the storm hit, he vanished. Until one fateful morning, when Rusty reappeared, dragging a mysterious bag of supplies through the wreckage. Clutched in its powerful jaws was a weathered burlap sack, heavy enough that the animal struggled with each step. Something inside that bag was important enough for this wild creature to venture into the domain of humans, important enough to carry this burden through hurricane-ravaged streets. But what's inside that bag? Inspired by true events, this is a story of resilience, second chances, and the unbreakable bond between the wild and the human heart. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The rain had finally stopped. After 3 days of Hurricane Harvey's relentless pounding, the skies above Sinton, Texas, had cleared to a pale blue. Sarah Miller stood on her front porch, surveying the damage to her new neighborhood. Water still pooled in the streets, and debris, branches, roof shingles, and unidentifiable scraps of people's lives littered the yards. She had only moved to Sinton 2 months ago, and already her new beginning had been baptized by one of the worst storms in Texas history. Sarah wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The air held a chill unusual for late August, as if the hurricane had blown away summer itself. She had been lucky. Her modest rental home stood on slightly higher ground than many of her neighbors' properties. Still, the power was out, her cell service spotty at best, and she felt the profound isolation that follows disaster, when the world becomes suddenly small and unfamiliar. She was about to go back inside when something caught her eye, a flicker of movement down the waterlogged street. Sarah squinted, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, there it was, an animal, tawny-colored and sleek, moving with deliberate purpose along the edge of the road. As it came closer, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A bobcat, walking right down Cypress Lane in broad daylight. Sarah froze, her hand gripping the porch railing. The wildcat wasn't particularly large, perhaps twice the size of a domestic house cat, but its powerful build and distinctive spotted coat were unmistakable. What struck her most, however, was what the animal was carrying. Clutched in its jaws was what appeared to be a bag, heavy enough that the creature had to drag it along the wet pavement. Her first instinct was alarm. Had the storm driven wildlife into the neighborhood? Should she retreat inside and lock her doors? But as she watched the bobcat's steady progress, something didn't fit with her understanding of wild animal behavior. It wasn't prowling or darting about nervously. Instead, it moved with the determined gait of an animal with a destination in mind. Curiosity overcame caution. Sarah stepped off her porch and, keeping a respectful distance, began to follow the unusual procession. The bobcat either didn't notice her or didn't consider her a threat, for it continued its labored journey without changing pace or direction. As she trailed behind, Sarah noticed other details. The bag was a small burlap sack, stained and weathered, with something bulky inside. The bobcat would stop occasionally to readjust its grip, never fully releasing the sack. With each pause, Sarah would stop too, holding her breath until the animal resumed its journey. They passed 3 blocks of storm-ravaged homes. Few people were out. Most had evacuated or were inside assessing damage. Those who glimpsed the bobcat through windows or from porches showed surprisingly little alarm. One elderly man waved at Sarah and called out, "Looks like Rusty made it through all right." Rusty? The bobcat had a name? Sarah had nearly caught up to the man to ask him what he meant when the bobcat turned abruptly, making its way up the driveway of a small ranch-style home. The property was in rough shape. A large oak tree had fallen in the front yard, narrowly missing the house itself. Tarps covered parts of the roof, and water stains marked the siding. The Bobcat didn't hesitate. It made directly for the side door, dropping its burden on the concrete stoop with what Sarah could have sworn was a sound of relief. Then it sat back on its haunches and made a chirping noise, not a growl or a hiss, but a sound almost like a bird call, high-pitched and insistent. Sarah stopped at the edge of the property, uncertain whether to approach further. Her question was answered when the side door creaked open and an elderly man peered out. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "You came back, and you brought supplies." He looked up and noticed Sarah hovering at the edge of his yard. "And you brought company too, I see." Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry for intruding," she called. I saw the Bobcat with the bag, and I couldn't help but follow. I was worried it might be in trouble." The old man chuckled, bending with some difficulty to pick up the burlap sack. "No trouble at all. Why don't you come up to the porch? I suspect you've got questions, and I could use the company. The name's George Parker." Sarah approached cautiously, her eyes on the Bobcat, which was now rubbing its head against George's leg in a gesture startlingly similar to a house cat greeting its owner. "I'm Sarah Miller," she said, stopping at the bottom of the 3 steps leading to the stoop. "I moved to Sinton just before summer. I live on Cypress, a few blocks back. Welcome to Sinton, though I wish the circumstances were better for making introductions." George nudged the Bobcat gently with his boot. "This here's Rusty. Don't worry, he won't harm you. He was born wild, but he's grown up around people. Got more house cat in his personality than Bobcat, most days." As if to illustrate George's point, Rusty flopped onto his side and began to groom his front paw, utterly unconcerned by Sarah's presence. "Would you like to come in for some coffee? It's instant, I'm afraid. No power for the real stuff." Sarah hesitated only a moment before nodding. There was something about George's weathered face and kind eyes that put her at ease, and after days of isolation during the storm, human connection, even with a stranger, felt like a lifeline. Inside, George's home was neat, but showed signs of hasty preparation for the hurricane. Furniture had been pushed to the center of the living room, away from windows. Plastic bins held what looked like important documents and photo albums. A battery-powered lantern sat on the kitchen counter, casting a warm glow in the dimness. George placed the burlap sack on the counter and opened it. Sarah peered inside to see packages of jerky, a few cans of tuna, and a bag of what looked like pet kibble. "I'll be," George said, shaking his head in wonder. "Rusty raided my emergency stash in the shed out back. Must have broken in there during the storm." He looked down at the Bobcat, which had followed them inside and now sat expectantly by a water dish in the corner of the kitchen. "Smart old boy knew we'd need food, didn't you?" As George filled a pot with bottled water for coffee, he began to tell Sarah the story of Rusty the Bobcat. "It was about 7 years ago now," he said, placing the pot on a camping stove. "I was checking my property line after another bad storm. Nothing like Harvey, mind you, but bad enough. Found this tiny Bobcat kitten, couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, caught in some debris. Mother nowhere to be found. He was half drowned, eyes barely open." George paused, spooning instant coffee into mugs. "I should have called wildlife services, I suppose. But I just lost my wife the year before, and something about that little fighter spoke to me. So I took him in. Just temporarily, you understand." Sarah smiled, sensing where this story was going. "Temporarily," she echoed softly. "Exactly. Nursed him with a bottle like a kitten. Once he was eating solid food, I built him an enclosure out back, thought I'd release him when he was strong enough. But by then, my son's family had moved in with me after Tom lost his job. Their boy, Jake, he was just a baby then, maybe a year old. He and Rusty formed a bond like nothing I've ever seen." George passed Sarah a steaming mug and gestured toward the living room. They sat, Sarah on the sofa and George in a worn recliner, while Rusty prowled the perimeter of the room before settling near George's feet. As Rusty got bigger, We tried to keep things wild. No playing with him like a pet, no letting him in the house. But that cat had other ideas. He'd escape the enclosure, find ways into the house. Started following Jake around the yard like a guardian. By the time Jake was 3, it was clear Rusty wasn't going anywhere. Is that even legal? Sarah asked, blowing on her coffee. George shrugged. Not strictly, no, but folks around here understand. We're rural enough that the authorities don't bother us much. Rusty comes and goes as he pleases. Hunts on his own, stays wild in that sense. But he always comes back, especially to see Jake. His face clouded. That's why I stayed behind when the evacuation orders came. Tom and his wife took Jake to San Antonio, but somebody had to look after Rusty. The hurricane must have been terrifying, Sarah said quietly. Worst I've ever seen, George admitted. When the eye wall hit, the noise was like a freight train. Part of the roof tore off. That's what the tarps are covering. Rusty was inside with me, and the crash spooked him something fierce. Bolted right out through a broken window. Hadn't seen him since, until today. As they talked, Sarah learned more about the Parker family. Tom, George's son, was a construction worker who had struggled to find steady work since the oil downturn. His wife, Melissa, worked as a nurse at the county hospital. And 6-year-old Jake, according to his grandfather, was the spitting image of his grandmother, with a heart twice as big. The conversation flowed easily as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. George showed Sarah photos. Jake as a toddler with Rusty curled protectively nearby. Rusty perched on the back porch railing watching birds. Jake on his first day of kindergarten last year, with Rusty watching from a distance as the school bus pulled away. The whole neighborhood knows about him, George explained. Most folks give him a wide berth, which is as it should be. He's still a wild animal, capable of defending himself. But he's never shown aggression to people. Quite the opposite, seems to have appointed himself neighborhood watchman. A memory clicked into place for Sarah. Is that why Mrs. Dennings down the street has a beware of Bobcat sign in her yard? I thought it was a joke. George laughed, a deep rumble that made Rusty's ears twitch. Edith Dennings has a wicked sense of humor, but that sign's kept more than one salesman from bothering her. I can tell you that. As they talked, Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time since the hurricane warnings had begun. There was something comforting about George's calm presence and his extraordinary relationship with the wild cat dozing at his feet. In the midst of natural disaster, this unusual friendship felt like evidence that the world still contained wonders alongside its terrors. When Sarah finally stood to leave, the light was fading. I should get home before dark, she said reluctantly. The streets are still a mess, and I don't have a flashlight. George nodded, rising stiffly from his chair. I appreciate the company, he said. It gets quiet here without the family. They'll be back once the roads clear up, but for now, it's just me and this reprobate. He nudged Rusty with his toe, earning a chirp of protest from the Bobcat. Do you need anything? Sarah asked. I have some extra canned goods, batteries. We're set now, thanks to Rusty's foraging skills, George said with a chuckle. But I wouldn't say no to a visit tomorrow, if you're so inclined. Jake would be mighty impressed to hear you followed Rusty home. Not many folks would be brave enough. Sarah promised to return and made her way back through the waterlogged streets as dusk gathered. The encounter had left her with a sense of wonder and connection to her new hometown that she hadn't expected to find, especially in the wake of disaster. True to her word, Sarah returned the next day and the day after that. She helped George clear debris from his yard and secure the tarps on his roof more firmly. Each day, Rusty would appear at some point, sometimes bringing gifts. Once a freshly caught rabbit, which George tactfully disposed of when the Bobcat wasn't looking, and another time a child's stuffed toy, bedraggled but somehow meaningful in the Bobcat's apparent desire to contribute. On the 4th day after the storm, while Sarah and George were sharing another cup of instant coffee on his porch, a mud-splattered pickup truck turned into the driveway. Before it had fully stopped, The back door flew open and a small boy with a mop of brown hair leapt out. "Grandpa, Rusty," he shouted, running toward the house. Rusty, who had been lounging in a patch of sunshine near the steps, leapt to his feet. With a chirp that sounded almost like a greeting, the bobcat bounded to meet the boy, stopping just short of him and circling excitedly. Jake skidded to a halt, beaming. "You're okay? I told Mom and Dad you'd be okay." He looked up at the porch, where George stood with tears in his eyes. "Grandpa." The reunion that followed brought tears to Sarah's eyes as well. Tom and Melissa Parker embraced George with the desperate relief of family who have weathered separation during crisis. Jake chattered excitedly about their evacuation adventure, while Rusty wove between their legs, occasionally sitting back to watch the humans with what Sarah could only describe as satisfaction. Melissa, a petite woman with Jake's same brown hair, noticed Sarah hanging back. "You must be the neighbor Dad mentioned on the phone," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for checking on him. We were worried sick until the cell towers came back up yesterday." "Sarah's been a godsend," George confirmed, and she witnessed Rusty's triumphant return with emergency supplies. Tom laughed, ruffling his son's hair. Jake was convinced Rusty would take care of Grandpa. Looks like he was right. As the family continued to catch up, Sarah prepared to take her leave, feeling she had intruded enough on their reunion. But Jake had other ideas. "Are you coming to the neighborhood cookout?" he asked, tugging at her sleeve. Sarah blinked in confusion. "Cookout," Melissa explained. "It's something of a tradition after storms. Once the roads are clear enough, everyone brings whatever food might spoil without power, and we have a big community barbecue. It'll be at the elementary school field this evening." She smiled warmly. "You should come. It's a good way to meet everyone in better circumstances than usual." The cookout was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her previous life in Houston. Despite, or perhaps because of, the devastation surrounding them, the people of Sinton gathered with remarkable spirit. Grills were set up on the elementary school's concrete basketball court. Tables salvaged from the school cafeteria held an assortment of thawing food, packages of hot dogs and hamburgers, containers of potato salad and coleslaw that needed to be eaten before they spoiled, and even a few rapidly melting gallons of ice cream. Children played tag on the field, their laughter a defiant counterpoint to the destruction visible beyond the school grounds. Adults clustered in groups, sharing hurricane stories and offers of help. Sarah moved among them somewhat shyly at first, but George made a point of introducing her to everyone as the brave soul who followed Rusty home. To her surprise, this made her something of a minor celebrity. "You actually followed him?" asked Mrs. Dennings, the woman with the "Beware of Bobcat" sign. "Most newcomers run the other direction when they see him." "I was curious," Sarah admitted. "He seemed so purposeful." "That's Rusty," agreed another neighbor, a man who introduced himself as Coach Wilson from the high school. "Smartest wild animal I've ever encountered. Been watching him grow up alongside Jake these past years. Remarkable creature." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself drawn into the community in a way she hadn't anticipated when she'd moved to Sinton, seeking a quieter life after her divorce. These people had an ease with each other born of shared history and mutual reliance. They knew each other's stories, strengths, and weaknesses. And somehow, in the space of one unusual week, Sarah had become part of that tapestry through her connection to George, Jake, and a semi-domesticated bobcat named Rusty. The highlight of the evening came as dusk fell. Jake, who had been conspicuously absent for about 20 minutes, appeared at the edge of the field. Rusty trotted at his side, causing a few of the out-of-town relief workers to gape in astonishment. "It's okay," Jake announced to the crowd. "Mom said Rusty could come if he behaves," and he promised he would. A ripple of laughter moved through the gathering. Melissa stood nearby, looking slightly anxious but trusting her son's bond with the unusual animal. True to Jake's word, Rusty remained calm, staying close to the boy and accepting occasional scraps of hamburger with dignified grace. One of the relief workers, a young man from Dallas who had arrived with a church group to help with cleanup, approached Sarah as she watched the pair. "Is that really a bobcat?" he asked in hushed disbelief. "Just hanging out at a community barbecue?" Sarah nodded, feeling a surge of pride in her new community's uniqueness. "That's Rusty," she said. "He's something of a local celebrity, especially now." "Now, haven't you heard the story?" Sarah asked, and found herself recounting the tale of Rusty's disappearance during the hurricane and his return with the bag of supplies. As she spoke, she realized the story had already begun to take on the quality of local legend, with details embellished in the retelling. "Some folks are saying he broke into the supply shed on purpose," she concluded. "That he knew George would need food and came back specifically to help. I'm not sure I believe that part myself, but..." She shrugged. "After what I've seen this week, I'm keeping an open mind." The relief worker shook his head in amazement. "I've been to 5 disaster zones in 3 states," he said, "and I've never seen anything like this. Usually, it's all anyone can do to take care of themselves and their human family members." As darkness fell completely, someone produced a guitar. Soon music filled the air, country songs and old hymns that everyone seemed to know by heart. Sarah found herself seated on a blanket beside George, Tom, Melissa, and Jake, with Rusty curled up nearby, apparently unbothered by the noise and activity. "You know," George said quietly, as Jake leaned against him, growing drowsy despite his excitement. "They say animals can sense storms coming, that they know when to seek shelter, when to run. I think they sense other things too." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. George nodded toward Rusty, whose amber eyes reflected the glow of the portable lights illuminating the gathering. "I think he knows who needs him. 7 years ago, it was a lonely old man who'd lost his purpose after his wife died. These days, it's a young boy learning about responsibility and the wild things we share this world with." He glanced at Sarah, and maybe, when the storm hit, it was a whole community that needed reminding that we're not so different from the wild things ourselves. We all seek shelter, we all gather what we need to survive, and we all come home in the end. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Home. That was what had been missing in her life since her divorce, since she'd left behind the remnants of a marriage that had withered slowly over years. She had moved to Sinton seeking peace, but what she'd found, through the unlikeliest of guides, was belonging. As if sensing her thoughts, Rusty rose from his resting place and padded over to where Sarah sat. With the same deliberate purpose she'd witnessed on that first morning after the storm, he settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his wild presence against her leg. "Well, I'll be," George murmured. "Looks like he's chosen you too." Sarah reached out tentatively, letting her hand hover near the bobcat's spotted fur without quite touching him. Rusty tilted his head, regarding her with inscrutable amber eyes. Then, with a chirp that seemed to convey acceptance, he leaned into her touch. In that moment, with the stars emerging above the storm-battered town and the voices of her new neighbors rising in song around her, Sarah felt the last pieces of her broken heart begin to heal. Like Rusty's mysterious bag, dragged home through floodwaters, she realized that sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry contain exactly what we need to survive, and that home is wherever we choose to bring them. As Hurricane Harvey receded into memory and Sinton began the long process of rebuilding, the story of Rusty the Bobcat and his supply run became part of local folklore. Sarah, no longer a newcomer but woven firmly into the community fabric, would smile whenever she heard it retold, sometimes with Rusty's bag growing larger and its contents more miraculous with each telling. The truth, she knew, was miracle enough, that in the aftermath of destruction, a wild creature had reminded them all of the unbreakable bonds that connect us, to each other, to the natural world, and to the places we call home.